Welcome, viewers. You are about to hear a captivating tale written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. Don't forget to subscribe. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, The Merchant of Death. The air in the Harrington estate was stifling, thick with the odour of leather-bound books and old mahogany. Sherlock Holmes stood at the threshold of the office, his eyes sweeping over the room with his usual deliberate calm, as though each object in the room held a secret. Behind him, the subdued murmur of Scotland Yard's finest echoed through the hall, but Holmes paid no mind. His attention was fixed entirely on the body before him. Edward Harrington, the merchant whose name had been known far and wide for his sharp business acumen, lay lifeless at his desk. His large, imposing figure, so familiar in photographs, now seemed unnervingly small in death. A trail of blood marred the corner of his mouth, evidence of the suddenness of his end. He had fallen forward, as though his final moments were spent, not in shock or struggle, but in a quiet acceptance. A moment's glance would suggest nothing of note, just the finality of death. But Holmes was never one to let appearances deceive him. Watson, standing slightly behind, felt the familiar chill run down his spine as he noticed Holmes's sharp intake of breath, his eyes narrowing as they fixed on the desk. The detective took a slow step forward, his long fingers brushing the edges of the cluttered writing surface with almost tender care. Nothing in the room seemed disturbed, no sign of a struggle, no broken items, nothing to suggest the violence of a murder had taken place. Yet the man was dead. "I trust you have secured the room?" Holmes's voice broke the silence, his words measured, deliberate, not so much as a question, but a command. It was evident from his tone that Holmes believed this scene to be far from ordinary. "Yes, Mr. Holmes." Inspector Lestrade's voice came from the door, tight with unease. "No one has entered or exited since we sealed it. We've examined the room. There's nothing to suggest anyone forced their way in." Holmes nodded absently, as though the inspector's words were merely background noise to his thoughts. His gaze lingered on the desk, where a single peculiar object lay beside Harrington's outstretched hand, a coin. It was not just any coin, but an old, worn one, its edges eroded by time. Yet its presence here, on a merchant's desk, was utterly out of place. Holmes crouched, his face almost level with the desk, and examined the coin with a practiced eye. Its markings were faint but distinct, an engraving of a ship's sail on one side and a symbol that appeared to be a stylized serpent on the other. "Strange," he murmured under his breath, his voice barely audible even to Watson. A merchant of Harrington's stature would have no interest in such items, yet here it lies. He leaned closer, touching the coin with the tips of his fingers, turning it over. "This is no mere trinket," he added, almost to himself. "This is a token, one with meaning." Watson stepped forward, his concern for his friend slowly outweighing his own intrigue. "What does it mean, Holmes?" he asked quietly, a hint of disbelief in his voice. "Who would leave such a thing behind?" Holmes paused for a moment, his gaze distant as he mulled over the possibilities. He stood, his tall figure looming over the body as he surveyed the rest of the scene. Everything about the room seemed meticulously arranged, as though Harrington had been preparing for something, perhaps a meeting, or a final correspondence. His thoughts, however, were interrupted as a low murmur arose from one of the officers outside. Holmes's piercing gaze shifted towards the door. "There's more to this than we can see," he remarked, his voice now tinged with an edge of irritation. "Something doesn't fit. The question is, what?" Lestrade, standing just behind Holmes, shifted uncomfortably. "I'm afraid I don't follow, Mr. Holmes. The man's dead, and it looks like, well, he may have died of natural causes. A stroke, perhaps." Holmes shook his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "Not a stroke, Inspector. This man was killed." "But how can you be sure?" Watson asked, his brow furrowing. The situation was becoming increasingly perplexing, and as much as he admired his friend's abilities, even he struggled to see the evidence. Holmes glanced back at him, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "That is for me to determine. Not everything can be understood at first glance, Watson." He stepped toward the desk again, his eyes tracing the meticulous arrangement of papers and ink bottles. Everything about the scene appeared too perfect, too deliberate. And yet, it was the absence of disorder that spoke volumes to Holmes. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of violence, at least not in the obvious sense. But the man was dead, and in that stillness, Holmes could already feel the stirrings of something much darker. The longer Holmes stood there, the clearer it became that the answers would not be found in the body itself, but in the subtle clues surrounding it. He let his gaze linger on the desk's contents once more, focusing on a small, seemingly insignificant detail, a letter that had been left slightly ajar. The edges were ragged, its contents unreadable from this angle, but it was the final clue Holmes needed. He turned to the inspector. "Lestrade, have someone retrieve that letter. Carefully, if you please." Lestrade, though perplexed by Holmes's calm demeanour, nodded. "Of course, Mr. Holmes." Holmes, now wholly absorbed in his thoughts, turned away from the desk and walked to the window, gazing out at the grounds of the estate. The darkness outside seemed to reflect the murky puzzle inside. "We are only beginning to scratch the surface," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. As the letter was carefully retrieved and brought to him, Holmes's mind raced through the possibilities. The nature of this crime was far too subtle to be immediately understood. It was the calmness of it, the lack of overt violence that troubled him the most. But it was the coin, that damned coin, that held the key. A symbol from a long-forgotten past, placed in the wrong hands. "Where is the widow?" Holmes asked suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "Clara Harrington, the wife?" "She is in the drawing room, sir," Lestrade replied. "She's been informed of her husband's death." Holmes turned back toward the body, his face inscrutable. "I will speak to her shortly. There are many things we must learn, but we must begin with her." The room seemed to grow colder as he walked out, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The air in the drawing room was thick with tension, the soft glow of the chandelier casting a warm, almost comforting light that did little to alleviate the suffocating atmosphere. Clara Harrington, her hands folded neatly in her lap, sat at the edge of a grand armchair, her delicate features composed into an expression of dignified grief. Her eyes, however, gave her away, twin pools of quiet distress, nervously shifting as Holmes entered the room. Holmes had seen this before, the studied calmness, the veneer of composure hiding the turmoil beneath. A woman, too poised for comfort, too practiced in hiding her emotions. He knew there was more to Clara Harrington's reaction than met the eye. "Mrs. Harrington," Holmes began, his voice smooth and unyielding. "I am terribly sorry for your loss. I understand this is a difficult time for you, but I must ask you some questions regarding your husband's death." Clara blinked, her lips trembling slightly as she nodded, and though she looked every bit the grieving widow, there was an air about her that struck Holmes as faintly rehearsed. He did not yet know what it was, but he could feel it. The dissonance in her composure, the way her gaze never quite met his, always drifting toward the window, the distant light of the estate's grounds beyond. "I understand," she whispered, her voice as soft as silk. "Ask whatever you must, Mr. Holmes. I want to understand how this could have happened. Edward was so healthy." Holmes allowed her a moment of silence before he spoke again, his gaze never wavering from her face. "Tell me, Mrs. Harrington, where were you at the time of your husband's death?" Clara's hands tightened in her lap, her fingers twitching slightly as though she fought the urge to fidget. I was in the garden, reading," she replied, her voice faltering slightly at the end, as though even she was uncertain of the truth of her own words. Holmes's keen eyes never left her. "Reading, you say? In the garden?" He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "And was there anyone with you? Any servants? Anyone who might have seen you?" Clara's eyes flitted toward the door, the briefest flash of discomfort passing across her face. "No," she said, her voice steadier now. "No one, Mr. Holmes. I was alone. I needed some time to myself." Holmes nodded, his mind already sorting through the details. Alone, with no one to vouch for her whereabouts. A common enough scenario, but one that raised the slightest of red flags. He was about to ask her more when Watson, who had been silently observing from the far side of the room, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Harrington," Watson said gently, "I understand this must be painful, but there are some things we must know. Were you and your husband on good terms? Was there any recent trouble between you?" The question hung in the air like a fog settling around the room. Clara stiffened, her hands now clutching the edges of her chair. Her eyes widened slightly, as though the question had taken her off guard. "No," she said quickly, her voice shaking for the first time. "Edward and I, we were fine. We had our disagreements, of course, but what marriage doesn't? There was no animosity." Holmes tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Of course," he said, his tone polite but sharp as a scalpel. "But still, it is important for us to understand the context. Perhaps you could tell us about the last time you saw your husband alive." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece the only sound between them. Clara's gaze flickered toward the window once more before she spoke, her voice quieter now, almost a whisper. I went to his study, to check on him. He had been working late, and I thought I might bring him a cup of tea. But when I entered, I found him just as you see him now." Her words stumbled out in a strangled breath, and she covered her mouth with one delicate hand, as though the mere thought of it caused her distress. Holmes nodded, though his mind was already elsewhere. "I see," he murmured, his eyes scanning the room as he considered her story. There was something about the way she phrased the account, the way she spoke of discovering her husband's body that struck him as odd. "And you didn't hear anything unusual? No sounds, no voices, nothing out of the ordinary?" Clara hesitated, her gaze lowering to her lap. "No," she said after a long pause, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, nothing." Holmes turned toward Watson, exchanging a glance. Watson, ever the skeptic, raised an eyebrow, and though he did not speak, his thoughts were clear. Something about this widow's account did not sit right with him either. But Holmes had learned to trust his instincts, and he did not dismiss Clara's words entirely. Not yet. "Very well," Holmes said, breaking the silence. "You've been most helpful, Mrs. Harrington. We will need to speak with the staff, of course, but we will be in touch soon." Clara stood slowly, her movements graceful yet stiff, as though the weight of her emotions threatened to overwhelm her. She gave a small, polite nod, and though she spoke no further words, Holmes noted the tightness in her jaw, the faintest quiver of her lip as she held herself together. Her grief was almost tangible, but her control seemed fragile, as though she feared losing it entirely. As the door closed behind them, Watson let out a soft breath. "Do you think she had a hand in it, Holmes?" Holmes didn't immediately respond. He was deep in thought, his eyes focused on the door through which Clara had just passed. His mind was turning over what he had heard, analysing the minutiae of her every word and gesture. "I don't know," Holmes said at last, his voice steady but laced with uncertainty. "There is something there, Watson, but I cannot yet say what it is. She could be innocent, or she could be lying. What I do know is this: she is hiding something." The words hung in the air between them as they moved down the hallway toward the next phase of their investigation. Their next stop would be the servants' quarters, where they would seek out further clues to unravel the web of deceit and mystery surrounding the death of Edward Harrington. The heavy silence in the hallway seemed to close in around them as Holmes and Watson made their way toward the servants' quarters. The estate felt eerily quiet now that Clara had withdrawn, leaving behind a tension that lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. Holmes moved with his usual purposeful grace, his long strides almost silent on the polished floors. Watson, however, felt the weight of uncertainty pressing on him, the mystery deepening with each passing moment. They approached the servants' wing and were greeted by the housekeeper, a woman in her late 50s with a face as stern as it was kind. Mrs. Winton had worked for the Harringtons for over 30 years, and her no-nonsense demeanour made her a fixture in the household. She was the first to speak, her voice low, but filled with an unmistakable authority. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Mrs. Winton said, nodding in acknowledgement. "I understand you're investigating the tragedy, and I assure you we've all been as shocked as anyone. But I hope you'll understand if I say that I have nothing to add. Mr. Harrington was always a kind employer." Holmes studied her with a practiced eye, noting the slight tremor in her hands as she folded them before her. Her eyes were steady, but there was something in the way her gaze darted ever so briefly toward the closed door behind her that piqued his curiosity. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it did not escape his attention. Watson, too, noticed it, though he was less attuned to such fine details. "Of course, Mrs. Winton," Holmes replied calmly, his voice smooth and measured. "But I must ask, did you see anything unusual on the night of Mr. Harrington's death? Any visitors? Or perhaps any sign of tension in the house?" Mrs. Winton's face remained neutral for a moment, but then her expression shifted. A flicker of hesitation crossed her features, and she turned slightly, almost as though she were weighing her words carefully. She glanced down the hallway before replying. I suppose there was something odd," she began, her voice quieter now, laced with a hint of unease. "Mr. Harrington had been in a particularly foul mood for the past few days. It wasn't uncommon for him to have his moments, but lately he seemed more distant. He argued with his business partner, Mr. Wilkins, the other evening. It was so heated I thought the glass might shatter." Holmes's attention sharpened at the mention of Wilkins. "And what was the argument about?" he asked, his tone almost casual but intense beneath the surface. Mrs. Winton hesitated again, and this time she looked toward the door of the drawing room, as if contemplating whether to divulge more. "I don't know the specifics, Mr. Holmes. I wasn't privy to the details. But Mr. Wilkins seemed rather upset. He was here for several hours that night in the study with Mr. Harrington. He left rather abruptly, and I overheard them exchanging heated words just before he departed." "Where was Mrs. Harrington during this argument?" Watson interjected, his voice thoughtful. "Surely she must have heard something." Mrs. Winton's brow furrowed, and she glanced at the closed door again. Her eyes flickered briefly, but she quickly masked the motion. "She was in the garden, I believe. I don't recall her being in the house at the time. She usually spends the evening out there when the weather is fine." Holmes gave a slight nod, his eyes never leaving the housekeeper. "I see. Thank you, Mrs. Winton. You've been most helpful. I believe we'll need to speak with Mr. Wilkins next." Mrs. Winton nodded, but there was an edge to her demeanour now. "If you say so, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice colder. "But if you ask me, the arguments between them weren't unusual. The two of them always had a tense relationship, especially after the recent business dealings. But no one could have known it would end like this." Holmes's expression softened, just slightly, as he stepped toward the door. "Indeed, no one could have known." As they left the servants' quarters and made their way toward the study where Wilkins had last been seen, Watson couldn't help but feel a tightening in his chest. The deeper they dug, the more complicated the mystery seemed to become. Mrs. Winton's information, while valuable, had only led to more questions. The argument, the tension between the partners, the presence of the widow, all of it felt like an intricate web being spun around them. "Holmes," Watson said quietly as they walked down the hall, "do you think Wilkins could be involved? It seems like a plausible motive, especially considering the business conflicts." Holmes remained silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "It is certainly possible, Watson, but we must not be so quick to jump to conclusions. There are many more pieces to this puzzle yet to be found." The study door creaked as Holmes pushed it open, and they stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the waning sun filtering through the tall windows. It was as though the room itself had not fully recovered from the events of the night before. Papers were scattered across the desk, though everything appeared undisturbed. Wilkins's presence was palpable, his absence all the more conspicuous. Holmes's eyes scanned the room meticulously, noticing small details that others would have overlooked. A small ink stain on a piece of paper, a discarded matchstick near the fireplace. But it was the unmistakable sense of urgency that lingered in the room, an energy that seemed to hang in the air long after the conversation had ended. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Look here." Watson approached, his eyes following Holmes's outstretched finger. There, beneath a pile of scattered papers, was a letter. Its envelope was torn, the contents partially exposed. Holmes carefully retrieved it and unfolded the fragile sheet. The words were faint, but legible enough for Holmes to read aloud. "To my dear Mr. Harrington, I trust you are prepared to keep our arrangement as discussed. You are aware of the consequences should you fail to comply." Holmes paused, his lips curling slightly as he reread the letter. "This changes everything." Holmes folded the letter with delicate care, his brow furrowing as he studied its contents. "This, Watson," he murmured, "is not merely a note of business. It is a threat." Watson stepped closer, peering over Holmes's shoulder as the detective turned the letter back toward him. "It doesn't say much, does it?" Watson remarked. "Who is this arrangement with? Who would send a letter like this to Harrington?" "That," Holmes replied, his voice tinged with the thrill of discovery, "is precisely the question we need to answer." He placed the letter on the desk and with a few swift movements began sorting through the other papers that had been carelessly scattered across the desk. The mention of consequences. This indicates something far more sinister than a mere business dispute. Holmes's mind was already racing ahead, piecing together the scant clues they had gathered. The argument between Harrington and Wilkins, the tensions within the household, and now this letter, a threat involving unspecified consequences. The complexity of the situation was deepening with every moment, and yet Holmes felt a certain clarity emerging amidst the fog of uncertainty. "There is something," Holmes continued, more to himself now, "about the timing of this. The letter was most likely written in the days leading up to Harrington's death. We must discover who sent it and why. But more importantly, we must uncover whether this arrangement was financial, personal, or something altogether more dangerous." Watson nodded, feeling the weight of the investigation pressing down upon him. "So, you suspect this arrangement is connected to the murder, but how does it tie into the coin we found at the crime scene?" Holmes's eyes flicked briefly to the coin resting on the desk, now tucked safely in his pocket. "That coin, Watson, is not a mere trinket. I believe it is a symbol, a marker of something. The letter speaks of consequences for failure to comply, and that suggests coercion. Whoever is behind this arrangement may well have used the coin as a token of some illicit dealings. We must trace its origin." The detective's words lingered in the air, heavy with the promise of a solution just beyond reach. The investigation was becoming a tangled web of deception, and each clue seemed to lead them further down a shadowy path. The coin, the letter, the strained relationships, none of it was as straightforward as it first appeared. "Holmes," Watson began, his voice hesitant, "do you think Mrs. Harrington knows more than she's letting on? She didn't seem entirely forthcoming when we questioned her earlier." Holmes met Watson's gaze with a steady, unblinking look. "I suspect she knows more than she has said. But at present, I believe she is caught in a web of her own making, entangled by the very secrets she tries to hide. We must tread carefully. If she is involved, she will undoubtedly attempt to mislead us further." The faint creak of the door startled them both. Lestrade appeared in the doorway, his face a mixture of frustration and curiosity. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, his voice tight. "We've found something else." Holmes turned sharply, his gaze fixing on the inspector. "What have you found?" Lestrade stepped forward, a thick file clutched in his hands. It's a record, sir. A list of transactions between Harrington and a few less reputable figures. One of them is a man named Edward Darrow, a notorious smuggler. He's been linked to a number of underground operations, including, well, let's say, certain items of historical value. Watson frowned. Smuggler? That sounds like a far cry from a respectable merchant. Holmes nodded, his mind already racing. Indeed. And yet, it seems that Harrington may have been involved in something far darker than anyone could have anticipated. This Darrow, he could be the key. If Harrington was tied to him, it's possible that this arrangement mentioned in the letter was part of a larger operation, an operation that could explain the threat, the coin, and perhaps even the motive for murder. Lestrade laid the file on the desk, and Holmes flipped it open with practiced efficiency. There, in black and white, were records of meetings between Harrington and Darrow, including a number of coded references to shipments. The language was cryptic, but it was clear enough to indicate that something illegal was taking place. The pieces are falling into place, Holmes murmured, scanning the documents. Harrington was no mere businessman. He was a part of a larger criminal network, one that operated in the shadows, hidden behind the mask of legitimate trade. Watson's voice was quiet but urgent. So this murder, could it be that someone wanted him silenced, to keep him from speaking about these dealings? Holmes gave a slow nod. It's possible, and if that is the case, we must consider all those who stood to gain from his death. It could be anyone, from his business partners to those involved in the illegal activities themselves. As the weight of this new information settled over them, Holmes turned back to the desk, his mind already racing through the implications. He picked up the coin once more, turning it over in his fingers. Its significance had grown tenfold in the span of mere minutes. This was no simple trinket. It was a key, a symbol of something larger, something far more dangerous. Watson, I believe it is time we pay a visit to Mr. Wilkins, Holmes said, his voice steady. Yet there was an undeniable edge to it now. We need to understand the nature of his relationship with Harrington, and whether he has any connection to Darrow and his dealings. Watson nodded, feeling the sharpness of Holmes's determination. The investigation had taken a sudden turn, and the pieces were beginning to click into place with an unsettling clarity. The tension in the air had thickened, each moment now charged with the weight of what was to come. With each step they took, the walls around them seemed to close in. Yet Holmes, ever the master of his craft, felt no fear, only the steady, unrelenting pursuit of the truth. The sun had dipped beneath the horizon by the time Holmes and Watson arrived at the sprawling, dimly lit estate of Charles Wilkins. The evening had grown colder, the air thick with the quiet anticipation of the revelation Holmes knew was imminent. They had been investigating the case for several days, but this moment, was different. Everything they had uncovered thus far pointed toward Wilkins, and now they were finally poised to confront him. The house itself was large, imposing in a way that suggested the wealth and ambition of its owner. Tall, wrought-iron gates marked the entrance, and the faint murmur of conversation could be heard through the drawn curtains of the drawing room. Holmes did not knock. He simply walked up to the door and turned the handle, an effortless motion that spoke of his certainty. Inside, the air was warmer than the night outside, though it felt stale, as though the house had not been properly aired in days. The smell of cigar smoke lingered faintly, and the heavy scent of brandy mingled with the musty undertone of old wood and antique furnishings. Holmes took a moment to survey the room, his sharp eyes scanning every inch as though seeking some clue that the rest of the world had missed. Wilkins was seated in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, a drink in hand, his expression a mixture of irritation and resignation as he looked up at his visitors. His presence was imposing, his broad shoulders filling the space around him with an aura of confidence. But Holmes was not swayed by appearances. "Mr. Wilkins," Holmes said, his voice as calm and measured as ever, "I trust you know why we're here." Wilkins put down his drink slowly, his gaze narrowing as he studied Holmes and Watson. "I've heard enough to know what this is about," he replied gruffly. "You think I had something to do with Harrington's death, don't you?" Holmes did not flinch. "We don't know who is responsible yet, Mr. Wilkins, but we are certainly trying to find out. You see, your name has come up in connection with some very troubling matters that could point to you being involved, either directly or indirectly." Wilkins' face hardened, and for a moment, Holmes thought he saw a flicker of genuine fear. It passed quickly, replaced by a defensive arrogance. "Troubling matters?" he repeated, his voice tight with barely contained rage. "I don't know what game you're playing, Holmes, but I can assure you I'm not involved in whatever nonsense you're accusing me of. I had no reason to harm Edward." Holmes stepped closer, his every movement deliberate, his eyes never leaving Wilkins's face. "No reason? That's where I think you're mistaken, Mr. Wilkins. You had plenty of reason. Financial strain, recent failed business ventures, a deteriorating partnership with Harrington. You were losing ground, and you knew it." For a moment, there was silence. Wilkins looked away, as though gathering his thoughts, but it was too late. Holmes had already hit upon the truth. "Listen to me, Holmes," Wilkins snapped, his voice rising in frustration. "You don't know the full story. You don't know what Harrington was involved in. He wasn't the man you think he was. He was tangled up in something dangerous, and I had no choice but to..." "Had no choice but to what?" Holmes interjected, his tone sharp. "To silence him, perhaps." Wilkins opened his mouth, but the words died on his lips as a sudden realization swept over him. Holmes's piercing gaze seemed to cut through his defenses, and he instinctively stood, his hand gripping the back of the chair for support. "I didn't kill him," Wilkins muttered, the words laced with panic now. "I didn't kill him, but I knew something was going to happen. I tried to stop it. I tried to warn him." Holmes didn't move. Warn him about what? Wilkins hesitated, as though weighing his options. Then, in a sudden burst of frustration, he strode to his desk and pulled out a small envelope from a drawer. He handed it to Holmes, his face pale. "Read it," he said quietly. "You'll understand then." Holmes took the envelope without a word, carefully removing the contents. Inside was another letter, written in the same hand as the previous one they had found in Harrington's office. The words were cryptic, but the message was clear. "Your partnership has become an obstacle. I will take matters into my own hands unless you comply. Consider this your final warning." Holmes looked up, his brow furrowed. This letter, like the first, was a threat. But there was something more to it, a desperation, an urgency that had not been present before. Wilkins had been caught in the crossfire, and now he was trying to justify his actions by pushing the blame onto someone else. "You see," Wilkins continued, his voice low, almost pleading, "I wasn't the only one in danger. Harrington. He knew too much. He had been involved in something far more dangerous than either of us could have imagined. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a pawn in a much larger game, one that we didn't control." Holmes's eyes narrowed as he processed the implications. "And you thought you could get him to back out? Stop whatever it was he had gotten himself involved in?" Wilkins nodded slowly. "That's right. But he wouldn't listen. He didn't take me seriously. And then everything changed. He began acting erratically, as though he'd lost his nerve. That's when I went to see him the night before." Holmes held up a hand, cutting him off. "And what happened when you saw him?" Wilkins hesitated again, but Holmes could see the faint sheen of sweat forming on his forehead. He was different. He was afraid. He told me he was in too deep and couldn't get out. That's when I left. I thought I had done enough. I never imagined he'd be dead by the next morning." The room fell silent as the weight of Wilkins's words hung in the air. Holmes had been right all along. There was more to this case than anyone had suspected. Harrington had been involved in something illicit, something dangerous, and Wilkins, though not the murderer, was deeply entangled in it. Holmes took a step back, his mind working furiously as he considered the pieces of the puzzle. "It seems, Mr. Wilkins, that you were right to fear for your life. But you were not alone in your fear, were you? There are others involved in this operation, and I intend to find them." Wilkins's face paled, and he opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again, as though the realization of the investigation's scope was finally sinking in. His part in this was over, and now he could do little but wait to see where Holmes's investigation would lead. "Mr. Holmes," he said finally, his voice strained, "you need to understand, if you continue down this path, you will bring more than just the truth to light. There are forces at work here that you have no idea about." Holmes met his gaze steadily. "That may be true, Mr. Wilkins, but the truth will come to light regardless." Wilkins' warning hung in the air like a fog, but Holmes remained unperturbed, his face an expression of calm determination. The mention of forces at work was not lost on him, yet he was certain that every secret uncovered would bring them one step closer to the truth, no matter how shadowed the road ahead seemed. Watson, who had remained silent through much of the exchange, now leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Mr. Wilkins, if you're suggesting that there are dangerous people behind all of this, then I think it's high time we inform the authorities. You've already provided us with ample information to understand your involvement, but I think it's clear now that we must uncover the entire network." Wilkins's eyes flickered nervously, and he shifted uneasily from foot to foot. His defensiveness had faded, replaced by a quiet fear that radiated from his every movement. No, he muttered, almost to himself. "You don't understand. The people involved are far beyond your reach, beyond anyone's." Holmes stepped forward, his voice measured but carrying a sharp authority. "Then explain it to me, Mr. Wilkins. Who are these people, and what exactly was Harrington involved in?" The room seemed to grow even quieter as Wilkins faltered. It was as if a part of him was considering the consequences of his next words. Finally, he exhaled a long breath and looked down, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Snap! Harrington wasn't just a businessman, as you've gathered. He had connections to the black market, to collectors of rare artifacts, items of historical value, most of which were stolen. He got involved with people who dealt in much darker things you can't even imagine." Holmes's mind raced as he processed the implications of Wilkins's admission. The coins, the threats, the mystery surrounding the murder. It was all coming together in a way that was far more dangerous than either he or Watson had anticipated. "And this arrangement?" Holmes pressed. "Was that connected to these illicit dealings?" Wilkins nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, but it wasn't just about money. It was about power. And people who don't play by the rules, Mr. Holmes, they have no loyalty, no honor. Once you're in, there's no way out." The room seemed to shrink around them as Wilkins's words sank in. Watson glanced at Holmes, his mind working quickly. He had thought the case to be troubling before, but now the true gravity of the situation was becoming clear. This was no simple murder. It was the first ripple in a much larger conspiracy. Holmes took a deep breath, his sharp eyes never leaving Wilkins. "You are a man who is clearly afraid, Mr. Wilkins, but fear can cloud your judgment. You may have believed that cooperating with these people would shield you, but you were wrong. You, too, are a part of this mess." Wilkins's hands clenched at his sides, but his voice was weak when he responded. "I didn't kill him. I didn't want this. But you have no idea what these people can do. If you keep digging, they'll come for you too. And when they do, no one will be safe." Holmes's gaze hardened, his voice resolute. "If I must, I will protect myself. But make no mistake, Mr. Wilkins, I will uncover the truth. And that truth, whether you like it or not, will bring this web of deceit to light." Watson exchanged a glance with Holmes. "You're saying that you know who these people are, Mr. Wilkins. But if they are as dangerous as you say, wouldn't it be best to bring them to the authorities before they can retaliate?" Wilkins's eyes widened, his breathing quickening as though he were caught between two equally perilous paths. "You don't understand," he repeated, his voice rising in frustration. "They'll destroy everything. Everything I've built. My family, my business. It's all at stake." Holmes stood still, his gaze unwavering. "Your future, Mr. Wilkins, is already sealed by your involvement in these dealings. The only question now is how much further you're willing to go to protect yourself." At that moment, Lestrade entered the room, his face flushed from running up the stairs. His presence, unexpected, seemed to pierce the thick tension that had built between the three men. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Lestrade said, his voice low and urgent. "You need to see this." Holmes turned toward the inspector, his eyes flicking between Lestrade and Wilkins. "What is it, Inspector?" Lestrade stepped forward, holding a piece of parchment, its edges yellowed with age. This was found among Mr. Harrington's personal effects. It was in a hidden compartment in his desk, locked away, clearly meant to be kept from prying eyes. Holmes took the parchment without a word, carefully unfolding it. The contents were stark, unsettling. It was an old ledger, its pages yellowed with age. The entries listed numerous names of individuals tied to antiquities, artifacts, and yes, the same historical objects that Wilkins had mentioned. But there was more. The names were accompanied by notations, codes, and symbols that Holmes recognized immediately. "This," Holmes's voice faltered for a moment, his mind processing the significance of the ledger. "This is a catalogue of stolen artifacts, each one tied to a different person, an entire network of criminals." Wilkins stepped forward, his expression darkening. "I told you, you don't know who you're dealing with." Holmes's mind was racing, his thoughts falling into place with a terrifying clarity. The death of Edward Harrington had not been an isolated incident. It was merely the first in a series of events designed to cover up the workings of a vast criminal network, one that stretched far beyond the walls of this house. Lestrade, looking over Holmes's shoulder, let out a low whistle. "This is bigger than we thought, isn't it, Holmes?" Holmes nodded, his expression grave. "Much bigger. And now we have a choice. We can either proceed cautiously, gathering more evidence, or we can confront the people behind this before they destroy any more lives." Watson's voice was firm, though tinged with concern. "How do we proceed, Holmes?" Holmes turned toward the window, his gaze distant. "We gather our allies, proceed with caution, and ensure that no one else is harmed in the process. But make no mistake, this case is far from over." The night had grown even colder, and the air outside felt like a living thing, sharp, biting, and unforgiving. Holmes stood in the center of the room, his back straight, his gaze fixed on the group that had gathered around him. The investigation had taken them to the brink, and now, more than ever, it was clear. The forces behind Edward Harrington's death were far more dangerous than anyone had initially anticipated. Watson, standing by the door, felt the weight of the moment. Holmes had been a rock throughout the investigation, but there was a tension in the air now that even he could not ignore. The evidence was mounting, and the stakes had never been higher. Holmes turned slowly to face Lestrade, who had been watching him closely. The inspector's face was pale, his brow furrowed with concern. "Are we sure this is the right move, Holmes?" Lestrade asked, his voice quiet but laced with doubt. "We're going up against people who have no regard for life, no fear of the law. It's dangerous." Holmes's eyes never wavered. "It is indeed, Inspector. But the law is not simply a set of rules to be followed. It is a shield against chaos, and it is our responsibility to wield it. We will not let this go unpunished. The people behind Harrington's death must be held accountable." Watson took a step forward, his voice steady. "We're not just dealing with ordinary criminals anymore, are we, Holmes? These are people who are part of something much larger, something that goes beyond stolen artifacts and smuggling." Holmes's lips twitched slightly, the faintest trace of a smile flickering on his face. "Indeed, Watson. We are dealing with a network, A shadowy organization whose reach extends far beyond what any of us initially thought. Lestrade shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between the two men. So what's our next move, Holmes? We have the names, the evidence, but we don't know who we're dealing with. Holmes's gaze grew intense, and for a moment, he appeared lost in thought. The danger was not just in the pursuit of the criminals. It was in how the criminals would respond. The letter, the ledger, the threats. They were all part of a larger game, one that had only just begun to unfold. I believe it's time we confront the mastermind behind it all, Holmes said, his voice low and commanding. We've gathered the pieces, and now we must act before they can cover their tracks. If we wait any longer, the truth may slip through our fingers. Just then, the door creaked open, and a figure stepped into the room. It was Clara Harrington. She stood in the doorway, her expression a strange mixture of defiance and fear. Her eyes, red from tears, were locked onto Holmes's with an intensity that spoke volumes. She seemed smaller than usual, her frame hunched as though the weight of the world had settled upon her shoulders. You're wrong, Clara said, her voice trembling but resolute. You think you know everything, Mr. Holmes, but you don't. You don't understand what's really happening here. Holmes studied her for a long moment, his gaze sharp. I understand more than you think, Mrs. Harrington. Your husband's death was not a random act. It was part of something far more sinister. And you are a part of it. Clara flinched, but she held her ground, her eyes never leaving his. You're wrong. I didn't kill Edward. I loved him. Holmes stepped closer, his voice quiet but filled with unshakable certainty. You may have loved him, Mrs. Harrington, but your actions speak otherwise. You were involved in his dealings, in the very web that led to his death. You knew far more than you admitted. Clara's face twisted in anguish, but there was something darker lurking beneath her pain. A quiet desperation, an understanding that she was running out of time. She took a step forward, her voice now laced with a raw edge. I couldn't stop it. They were going to kill him anyway. I tried to protect him, but it was too late. Holmes paused, his eyes narrowing as he tried to read her. Who? Who were you trying to protect him from, Mrs. Harrington? Clara hesitated, and for a brief moment, Holmes could see the internal battle raging within her. She wanted to speak, wanted to reveal the truth, but something held her back. A fear too great to overcome. It's too dangerous, she whispered, her voice breaking. You don't know who they are, Mr. Holmes. You don't know what they're capable of. Holmes's expression softened, just slightly, but his resolve remained firm. Then tell me, Mrs. Harrington. Tell me everything, and perhaps I can protect you. But if you remain silent, you'll only be complicit in your husband's death. A long silence followed, the weight of the decision pressing down on Clara's shoulders. She trembled, her breath shallow, and for a moment it seemed as though she might crumble. But then, her shoulders squared, and her voice grew steady. They're here, she said, her words barely audible. They've been watching you. The statement hung in the air like a heavy stone. Holmes's mind raced, but he said nothing. He knew that the danger had escalated beyond anything they had prepared for. The people they were up against were not mere criminals. They were something far more dangerous, and they were closing in. Before anyone could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. The door to the drawing room burst open, and several figures stepped inside. Two men, their faces concealed by dark masks, stood in the doorway, their eyes gleaming with cold menace. Holmes's heart skipped a beat. The situation had gone from dire to deadly in an instant. Watson's hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his side, but Holmes held up a hand, signalling for caution. He could feel the tension in the room, the air crackling with the sudden threat that had materialized. One of the masked figures stepped forward, his voice low and gravelly. Mr. Holmes, I believe you've meddled with matters far beyond your understanding. Holmes didn't flinch, his eyes never leaving the man. I understand more than you think, and I intend to see this through, no matter the cost. The masked figure smiled, a cruel twist of the lips. Then prepare yourself, Holmes. You have no idea what you're up against. The two masked figures stepped fully into the room, their presence towering and intimidating. Holmes remained unnervingly calm, his eyes flicking briefly to Watson, whose hand remained on his revolver, though the detective silently urged restraint. The tension was palpable, like the strained silence before a storm. "Who are you?" Holmes's voice was calm, almost casual, despite the danger in the room. His mind was already calculating their next move, studying every detail with his usual precision. The man who had spoken earlier, tall, with broad shoulders and a deliberate, menacing gait, took another step forward. "You already know too much, Mr. Holmes," he said with a cold smirk, his voice muffled by the mask. "But there's still much you don't understand. We've watched you, followed every step of your investigation. You think you've uncovered the truth, but you're only scratching the surface." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Then perhaps you'll explain to me exactly what the surface hides," he said evenly, his voice betraying none of the anxiety the situation might have caused someone less composed. "Let's not play games," the man responded, his patience running thin. "You've uncovered part of our operation and now you're a threat. People like you don't walk away from this. You're too dangerous to be left alive." The words struck with chilling finality, and Holmes's mind raced as he considered their options. It was clear now that these men were not merely hired muscle. They were part of something far larger, an organization that had anticipated every step of the investigation. Watson stepped forward, his hand tightening on the handle of his revolver. "Holmes, we need to leave. This is getting out of hand." Holmes's eyes flicked toward Watson, and in that brief glance, the silent understanding passed between them. They had no choice but to act now. "No, Watson," Holmes replied quietly. "We will not run. Not this time." At that moment, the door behind them slammed shut with a heavy thud, and another masked figure appeared in the doorway, his presence a silent warning. The room was now completely sealed, the walls closing in. There was no escape. Holmes remained still, his eyes betraying none of the tension he felt. "I have one question for you," he said, his voice a quiet force that cut through the thick atmosphere. "How much do you truly know about Edward Harrington?" The man before him paused, momentarily taken aback. The faintest flicker of hesitation passed over his masked face before he quickly regained control. "Harrington was a means to an end, a useful tool in a much larger scheme," he said, his voice growing colder. "He got too greedy, though. He thought he could control the situation. That's where he made his mistake." Holmes tilted his head, sensing an opening. "And you thought silencing him would solve your problems? You're wrong. Killing him only invites more questions, and soon, the world will know what you've done." The man chuckled darkly, the sound echoing in the room. "You think you can stop us, Mr. Holmes? You're just one man. You have no idea what you're up against." Holmes's eyes never wavered. "I've faced men far more dangerous than you, and I've never been wrong about them. So tell me, how deep does your organization go?" For a moment, the masked man said nothing, his eyes narrowing as if contemplating how much to reveal. Then, with a malicious grin, he spoke. "You think we're just a bunch of thieves and murderers? We're much more than that. We control information. We control power. We're the ones who shape history, Mr. Holmes. The artifacts, the money, the lives, it's all part of a greater plan. And your investigation, it's a mistake." Holmes's mind was racing now. Everything was beginning to come together, but there were still pieces missing. What was this larger plan? What did they mean by shaping history? But there was no time to dwell on it. The moment had come for action. "Watson now," Holmes commanded, his voice sharp. Before the man could react, Watson drew his revolver and fired a warning shot into the ceiling. The loud bang echoed through the room, and the masked figures froze momentarily, their attention momentarily diverted. It was all the distraction they needed. Holmes moved swiftly, his body a blur of calculated motion. He lunged toward the man in front of him, grabbing him by the wrist and twisting it sharply. The gun he had been holding slipped from his grip, clattering to the floor. In a swift, fluid motion, Holmes used his opponent's momentum to send him crashing into the side of a table, sending it toppling over. But before Holmes could react further, the third man moved, his hands reaching for a concealed knife. The tension in the room escalated as the blade flashed in the dim light, aimed directly at Holmes. "Holmes!" Watson shouted, his voice filled with urgency. Holmes didn't hesitate. His mind worked faster than his muscles could move, and with a swift twist, he ducked beneath the strike, narrowly avoiding the sharp edge of the blade. His own hand shot out, grabbing the assailant by the arm and disarming him with a swift twist of the wrist. The knife flew across the room, embedding itself into the wall with a dull thud. For a brief moment, it felt like the world was suspended in time. The masked figures had been thrown off guard by the swiftness of Holmes's movements, but the tension in the room remained thick. Holmes and Watson stood back to back, facing off against three masked men who now realized that they were not dealing with ordinary adversaries. One of the men, the one who had spoken earlier, regained his composure and took a step back, his voice low but deadly. "You should have known when to quit, Holmes. Now you'll pay the price for your interference." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "I've never been one to quit when there's still work to be done. But you?" he asked, his voice tinged with amusement. "You are out of time." In the next instant, the door behind the masked figures burst open, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor. Another figure appeared, a silhouette in the doorway, a man whose presence seemed to fill the room with a palpable sense of dread. His eyes gleamed with dark knowledge, and he carried himself with the silent authority of someone who was used to controlling everything around him. This was the mastermind. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, his movement slow and deliberate. The room seemed to shrink as the man entered, his presence heavy, overwhelming. Holmes stood still, his eyes narrowing as he took in the figure before him. Tall, cloaked in darkness, his sharp features obscured by the low light. But there was no mistaking the cold authority that radiated from him. This was the mastermind. The tension in the room deepened, like a taut string ready to snap. The three masked men, who had once seemed so certain of their power, now stood frozen, their attention divided between their leader and the two detectives who had just proven themselves far more formidable than they had anticipated. Holmes remained calm, his mind working furiously as he took in every detail. This man, whoever he was the final piece of the puzzle, the one who had orchestrated it all. The death of Edward Harrington, the dangerous web of deceit, the criminal network, it was all linked to him. "You must be the one behind all of this," Holmes said, his voice unwavering as he faced the figure. "The one pulling the strings from the shadows." The man's lips curled into a faint smile, but it was a smile devoid of warmth, like the cold gleam of a knife. "So, you finally figured it out, Mr. Holmes. Impressive, but irrelevant." His voice was smooth, each word calculated to evoke a sense of superiority. "You're too late. The pieces are already in place. You think you can stop us? You think you can expose everything?" Holmes's gaze never wavered. "I don't need to stop you," he said coolly. "I only need to expose you. And once the truth is known, your entire operation will collapse." The man chuckled, a low, mocking sound that seemed to vibrate with menace. "You believe that? You still think you're in control of this situation?" His eyes flicked to the masked men, who shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. "You're not. You've played right into our hands. Your little investigation, your search for the truth, it was all part of the plan." Holmes's expression didn't change, but Watson, standing beside him, felt the ground shift beneath him. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of confusion and growing concern. "We've followed every lead. We've uncovered the truth. How could this have been part of your plan?" The man's eyes gleamed with a dangerous light as he stepped closer. "Because, Dr. Watson, you see, you weren't chasing the truth. You were chasing shadows. You thought you were solving a murder, but all along, you were chasing after a ghost." He paused for a moment, savoring their bewilderment. Harrington's death was never the point. The point was making you believe there was something to uncover, something worth chasing. Holmes's pulse quickened. "You're saying the murder was a diversion?" The man nodded, his smile growing wider. "Precisely. A simple little crime to throw you off the scent. It was never about the coin, never about the artifacts, and certainly never about Harrington. It was about what happened after. It was about creating a distraction, a story to draw in the curious, the clever, like yourself." Holmes's mind raced. The false leads, the carefully planted clues, the false suspicions, everything had been part of a larger scheme. The criminal network was only the surface of something far more insidious. "You wanted us to uncover this," Holmes murmured, his voice tinged with realization, "so that you could take control of everything in plain sight. You used Harrington's death to manipulate us." The man's grin deepened, his gaze cold and unyielding. "It wasn't just about control, Mr. Holmes. It was about trust. You see, there are those who trust the system, the law, the detectives, the people who think they can expose the truth. But the truth has a way of bending to the will of those who understand how to shape it." Holmes took a step back, his eyes narrowing as he processed the enormity of what this man was implying. The criminal network, the forged documents, the stolen artifacts, they were all part of a greater power play, a game of manipulation where the truth itself was the pawn. "You've been playing a dangerous game," Holmes said quietly, his voice carrying a quiet intensity. "But I'll make sure it's one that ends with you." The masked men stirred, shifting uncomfortably. The leader raised a hand, silencing them with a mere gesture. His eyes locked onto Holmes's with cold resolve. "I don't think you understand, Mr. Holmes. You've already lost. There's no turning back now." Holmes's voice was like steel. "There's always a way forward. There's always a way to expose the truth. And I will do so." At that moment, a muffled sound came from the hallway. A distant noise, but one that was unmistakable. Footsteps. The unmistakable tread of boots. The man's expression faltered for the briefest moment, his attention diverted. Holmes saw his opportunity, his eyes flashing with the quickness of his mind. Without a word, Holmes turned and gestured to Watson, who followed in an instant. The two detectives rushed toward the door, pushing past the masked figures, their movements swift and practiced. The leader's voice echoed in the room, sharp and urgent, but Holmes didn't look back. "I've already called for backup," Holmes said as they made their way toward the door. "It's over." Watson's heart raced as they exited the room and burst into the hallway, where they were met by a small group of uniformed officers who rushed in to secure the premises. The mastermind's voice echoed in their ears as the officers took control of the scene. "You think you've won, Holmes? You think this is the end?" Holmes turned to face him, his gaze steady. "It's the beginning of the end," he replied simply. The officers moved quickly to arrest the masked figures, who put up little resistance. The man in charge, however, stood motionless, his eyes cold with the certainty of defeat. Holmes had seen this look before, the look of a man who had lost, and knew it. "Your network is finished," Holmes continued, his voice calm and resolute. "Your secrets are exposed, and soon the world will know what you've been hiding." The man opened his mouth, but no words came out. For a moment, he stood there, his gaze locked onto Holmes's, with the unspoken realization that his power had crumbled. The game was over. As the officers led the mastermind away, Holmes allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The truth had been uncovered, and the tangled web of deceit was finally unraveled. Watson, still catching his breath, turned to Holmes with a look of admiration. "You were right all along, weren't you?" Holmes nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's not always about the clues, Watson. Sometimes it's about the ones we don't see, the ones that were meant to distract us." The two of them stood there side by side, watching as the final pieces of the case fell into place. The room, once thick with tension and danger, now felt empty, hollow, a quiet testament to the power of truth. As the evening wore on and the last of the criminals were taken into custody, Holmes and Watson made their way back to the familiar comfort of their shared office, the weight of the case lifting from their shoulders. Holmes's mind, ever restless, was already turning toward the next mystery, the next puzzle. But for now, in the quiet aftermath of victory, he allowed himself a moment of peace.